How did we get here? To answer that question, we likely have to go all the way back to 2010 and the Arab Spring. Remember the Arab Spring? Young people with cheap phones toppled decades of fear. Authoritarians watched their statues wobble and billionaires watched their markets shake. The Arab Spring terrified authoritarians in the billionaire class. It pushed them to collude with social platforms to re-centralize control, and it evolved now into a model of informational autocracy that extends power without having tanks in the street. The reason why we're here today, and the reason why you see more and more countries around the world take an authoritarian stance, is because of the intersection of billionaires, social media platforms, and informational autocracy coming together to create a surveillance state. This isn't science fiction. In fact, when billionaires like Larry Ellison tell you exactly what they want to see in the future, you need to pay attention. Check this out and I'll be right back.
The truth is, we don't really turn it off. What we do is we record it so no one can see it, but no one can get into that recording without a court order. So you get the privacy you requested, but a court order, if you get a court order, we will, judge, can order, I want to look at that, this so-called bathroom break. We won't listen in unless there's a court order. But we transmit the video back to headquarters. So headquarters and AI is constantly monitoring the video. The police will be on their best behavior because we're constantly recording, watching and recording everything that's going on. Citizens will be on their best behavior because we're constantly recording and reporting everything that's going on. There's no reason for, by the way, high-speed chases. You shouldn't have high-speed chases between cars. You just have a drone follow the car. I mean, it's very, very simple. And the new generation of autonomous drones. All of these are AI applications.
That's the future that Ellison wants. A constant, sustained surveillance state that watches every single thing that you do. And that future state has its grandparents in the Arab Spring and the social media platforms that allowed for the Arab Spring to take hold and rattle many of these autocrats, many of these dictators and oligarchs, and rethink their relationship with social media platforms. And what do we see today? Today, what we see is that every social media platform, every media entity is owned and controlled by various billionaires and billionaire interests. They control the message, they control the algorithm, they control what you see, and they shape the reality in front of you, to the point that going forward, they can actually rely on a consistent base of the population being swayed into their point of view and maintaining their status quo and maintaining their hold on power regardless of how bad things get. That's what we're staring down the barrel of today. But the whole reason why we're staring down that barrel is because of the Arab Spring and what happened as a result. So one of the things that we have to look at and understand is we need to understand what the Arab Spring was, and we also need to understand what informational autocracy is. The Arab Spring refers to a wave of popular uprisings that began in Tunisia in late 2010, and that spread through the entire Middle East. Egypt saw it, Libya saw it, Bahrain, Syria, and beyond in 2011. The reasons why the populations rose up against these dictatorial regimes was because of everyday things that we even have seen in our own experience: lack of jobs, high prices, corruption, lack of human dignity. And all of that was mobilized through cheap technology, primarily cheap phones, social media platforms, satellite TVs, and all of that linked to a frustrated population and a shared story. It wasn't just one movement or one ideology. It was a cascade where seeing others act and seeing others have the courage to mobilize lowered the risk of acting yourself. And that allowed people to take to the streets. Now, the regimes in power at the time tried everything they could to head this off at the pass. They tried censorship, throttling, crackdowns, and sometimes it yielded some results in the short term, but oftentimes it backfired and also accelerated the resistance. What this signaled to those in charge, the billionaires and their puppets in various governments, was that social media democratize communication, and that wasn't going to be sustainable going forward. Something needed to be done where these social media platforms and these media platforms needed all sorts of backdoors so that government could re-exert power and control and stifle any uprising so that their grip on power was never lost. That was what came out of the Arab Spring. Now, the other thing that we have to understand is what we're talking about when we talk about informational autocracy. So, what that refers to is a style of rule that relies less on tanks in the street and more on controlling what citizens believe about the regime's competence. Think about what we're seeing today all around the world. What we're seeing around the world is that 70% of all of the countries in the world are under some sort of authoritarian rule. That stands in stark contrast to the world in the 1980s. During the Cold War, you'll had roughly half of the world, or less than half of the world, that was under dictatorial control. That's shifted. Now, what's different is that you're not seeing tanks in the streets and mass executions like you saw in Tiananmen Square and other places. What you're seeing, though, is the Viktor Orban model of dictatorship, the Vladimir Putin model of dictatorship, where reality is bent and warped into a particular point of view through the use of all sorts of media and social media platforms. Now, what you see in these different dictatorships around the world is that there's still elections, there's still courts, there's still economic growth stats that are pushed out, but media is shaped to fit the narrative that the government dictates. And what you have with this sort of governing model is that you have high apathy and you have a fear that things could be much worse if an alternative was put into place. You still have state sanctioned repression, but it's targeted and it's off camera. You have legal and PR language that's used as agents of the state to preserve the brand that the state is trying to control. What you see when you have informational autocracy implemented is that it's manufactured apathy, it's manufactured weakness, it's learned helplessness that's brought to a national scale. And the way you achieve that is by flooding the zone and all of the media channels with narratives that are either misinformation, disinformation, or favorable to the regime. The other side of that coin is that all of these regimes nudge their willing media and social media platforms to adjust their algorithms and their models to bury dissent. Does that sound familiar yet? So when you look at all of that, the goal isn't to convert anyone to any particular ideology. It's to keep things quiet in the streets and to keep things as stable as possible so that the grift and the siphoning off of resources to the oligarchy can continue. And that's what we see in the vast majority of these dictatorships in place today. And that's actually what we're seeing in the US. Now that we know what the Arab Spring involved and how social media platforms played a critical role in those uprisings, and we also know how the vast majority of dictatorships operate today through informational autocracy, it's time to bridge the gap and understand the role of social media platforms and media platforms today in expanding the role of the oligarchy, the billionaire class, and their puppets in government to maintain control. And I mentioned earlier how Larry Ellison is committed to a global surveillance state. He's not alone. Every single one of the tech oligarchs that you see, from Musk to Bezos to Zuckerberg, Ellison, you name the who's who of Silicon Valley, they're all committed to a single-minded purpose of creating a pure capitalist state where the CEOs are in charge of various regions and all of us are just lowly cogs in the wheel that can be disposed of when we cease to be productive. And the way that end goal is going to be reached is by the manipulation of all of these algorithms and the public narrative and the warping of reality to fit what they want to see. Now, a decade ago, when these protests ripped through Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Syria, and others, social media wasn't what started the fires. It wasn't what started these revolutions, but it helped those who were organizing and amplifying those get their message out. It lowered the cost of joining. It amplified a shared story. It connected local struggles to global eyes. And what we saw with the aid of social media was that we saw a diaspora of networks coaching tactics. We saw international activists sharing playbooks, and we saw a movement come together along the shared ideals of dignity, bread, and end to corruption. And all of that was moving at the speed of a retweet. Governments in that time lost their monopoly and control on information, at least for a little bit. They tried to censor, they throttled, they arrested, they cut the internet off. But all of these networks who didn't have a leader reassembled anyways and were able to push forward. And at the same time that all of this was happening, what we saw in the post Cold War era was a new kind of strongman rising to power all across the world. These new strongmen, the new breed, were less about the gulag and more about the show. Instead of mass killings, they preferred manipulating the population through curated feeds, compliant media and TV entities. They cultivated a network of friendly oligarchs. And then all of these upstarts in the new dictatorships, they allowed for democratic practices to take place, but they gamed every element of it so that they could gain power and maintain power. And when you look at that dynamic, it's those playbooks that the current regime, and particularly Steve Bannon and others around this regime, deployed to gain power in the US. When you think about those uprisings, it taught everyone that was on the ground floor an important lesson that there's more of us than there are of them. But there were lessons learned by the oligarchs and those in power as well. And those lessons they learned was that you cannot have democratized communication. You cannot have an uncontrolled public square. All of these platforms that you rely on getting messages out and communicating a narrative, those need to be tightly controlled by the government in order for those in power to maintain control. And what they did is that they set forward on rewiring the playing field and making sure that it never happens again. So, how did they actually do that? When you think about how the Arab Spring happened, the first thing that social media platforms allowed was that it crashed the barrier to protest. Before social media platforms, people were isolated and operating in silos. You would have pockets of resistance here and there, but it was generally disconnected and there was no way to coordinate your narrative and have that narrative take hold across the population. And then as technology improved and social media platforms expanded, what you saw was that what you had in your hand and the platforms that you were on allowed for those feelings that you were having to consolidate and create communities. And those communities created momentum and traction into whatever you wanted to push forward. And as you saw your friends, your neighbors, and people across the country align with you, you started to recognize that, hey, what I'm feeling in my little town over here is the same thing as they're feeling halfway across the country and halfway around the world. There's more to this than just what I'm feeling. So maybe it's time for me to take action. And that's how social media allowed for mass protests to take hold. The second thing that happened as you saw social platforms accelerate the Arab Spring and other protest movements was that these networks beat hierarchies. When you look at these resistance movements, these were coalitions that were decentralized. They didn't have a single boss giving orders. You saw these coming out of mosques, tea houses, student unions, worker groups, and they were stitched together by a shared story and time frame. Oftentimes, these movements accelerated on Fridays after prayers. They met after the prayers and they marched from there. And what made that effective was that there wasn't a single throat to choke. Police could go after one segment and you still had multiple other segments that were moving in unison all over the country. So when you have pockets of decentralized resistance coalescing and mobilizing, it becomes difficult to control. One of the other interesting things about the Arab Spring and social media's influence in the Arab Spring was that this allowed people in the diaspora to lend their voices and support and encouragement from all sorts of different corners of the world. What you saw was diaspora communities from all corners of the world amplifying all of these tactics. So if the TV networks shut down visibility, you still had everyone on their phones sharing this out across their various social media platforms. And what this allowed for was an information overload and a democratization of the information that was available that mobilized even more people to take to the streets. People like to downplay all of this as slacktivism and movements by hashtags, but all of these things combined together acted in a lot of ways like a pressure cooker. Every little drop of engagement counted, and it created a critical mass which set off the Arab Spring, and it made it impossible to control. What did you see from the regimes that were experiencing this? The regimes panicked. They tried to censor, they throttled the internet, they shut down the internet, they did mass arrests. Some of these moves backfired, but all of them just delayed the inevitable. But it taught all of the people in charge and others watching, and the billionaire class and the millionaire class and all of their puppets in government around the world, an important lesson. When you try to beat down the crowds on a live feed, that's expensive. That creates martyrs. It makes markets unstable. It creates a lot of ill will, and it actually accelerates the movement against you. So what did they do? They updated their operating systems. They realized that they could never win another war or an uprising by completely crushing the opposition in full view of all of the assembled masses and live streams. So they had to take a different approach, and they had to play a long game. And what happened was a shift in tactics by all of these autocrats, where they're creating the appearance of competence. They're creating the appearance of growth. They're machining the numbers to create the veneer of prosperity. Elections, critics voice their opposition only to be shouted down as radicals or leftists or whatever label that you want to see, thanks in large part to media that's been co-opted and under control by state actors. So rather than the quick, flashy tanks in the street approach, these people started playing the long game. And the intent of the long game was to make you too apathetic to care and make you numb instead of angry. Because the goal is to keep the lights on and make sure that the elites continue to get paid, and you do all of your disappearings off camera and unnoticed. And what did you actually see? The data matched the vibe that they were trying to push forward. When you look across the last few decades, you've seen political killings drop in many places. And a lot of what is more aligned to image management and selectively harassing people by using legal methods, by weaponizing departments of justice or taxes or regulatory agencies to go shut down your enemies. You still have violence, but it's off camera and it's targeted and it's wrapped in language of anti-extremism or national pride to protect the brand that these autocrats are trying to push forward into their countries. So why did you see the switch from what we're used to, jackbooted thugs in the street, throwing people into train cars, to more talking points or a soft dictatorship? The reason why you saw that is because the global economy runs on protecting and expanding shareholder value. Education, markets, stock markets, those all get global attention. And when you're crushing dissent under the treads of your tanks, shareholders don't like that. That spooks investors and it invites sanctions. So the better way around is to capture the media, tweak the algorithm, control ad budgets, and that gives you the same outcome. You maintain control, but you keep the bloodletting to a minimum. We've seen the receipts of all of this across all sorts of countries. In Peru, you have Montesinos paying off TV stations to shape the coverage in the view that he wants. That bribe is cheaper than the battalion rolling through the streets dealing with riots. And halfway around the world from there, in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who is talking about restraint, doesn't make a spectacle, manages the optics. You have two different geographies using the same playbook. Appear competent and operate methodically, keep the blood out of the streets, and you maintain power. So you see that model in play. And now what you've seen is social media platforms making a shift where they're acting as agents of the state. Everyone in the Arab Spring learned the same lesson. It showed that open networks and open platforms can topple governments and topple regimes. So, what did the billionaire class, the millionaire class, and all of these leaders decide to do? Well, let's close down the networks and make sure that we have all sorts of back doors where we have our fingers in the pie and can control the levers of information as they go out. Essentially, what they did is that they turned private platforms into soft deputies of state power. And if they didn't do that, they turned these platforms into risk averse gatekeepers to make sure that the billionaires don't lose their money. And when you think about it, all of these tech oligarchs want the same thing. They want a future where they're in charge, all their resources sit within their bank accounts, and everybody else is depending on them for survival. So, in order to do that, you need quiet streets, you need steady revenue, and you need a calm political environment. And what you're seeing is a massive centralization of all sorts of different things dressed as safety.